Welcome to the Unlist. Today's video is all about Givenchy Gentleman, released originally in 1974, and as of 2017, ostensibly replaced with a different fragrance, although a slight twist on the name. It's Gentleman Givenchy instead of Givenchy Gentleman. I think the reversal of the words is meant to separate the two, but people still call them both gentlemen. It's just whether you're referring to Gentleman 1974, I guess, or Gentleman 2017. They share a bottle shape, obviously, and they both have, or at least they both shared a wraparound label. The original Gentleman no longer has that signature wraparound label, which was first introduced on Monsieur de Givenchy back in 1959. I kind of wish the original fragrance, actually all the original masculines, kept those wraparound labels, because Givenchy was probably one of the most iconic brands to do packaging like that. And when they sort of remove that iconography, if you will, and replace it with something more generic, then it just sort of diminishes the fragrance. Even though it doesn't really diminish it scent-wise, it diminishes it in the mind's eye, right? So anyway, this video is all about the fragrance. I have talked at length about patchouli in particular, so I'm not going to cover any of that ground again here. This is not a part 2 for my patchouli video, where I did sort of discuss some of my favorite patchouli fragrances, and among them were Givenchy Gentleman and Giorgio Beverly Hills for Men. Now, I could have done a video about the Giorgio fragrance, but there's honestly not enough information on that fragrance to justify 15 to 25 minutes of me blathering about it. The long and short of it is that Giorgio Beverly Hills was a boutique. They didn't make their own clothes. They were a boutique reseller, and they eventually became famous for, I guess, their customer service, and they were co-owned by two different people, and one of those people, Fred Heyman, I guess got into a conflict with the other owner, whose name eludes me right now, but they butted heads, and eventually Fred Heyman sold his share and left and started another boutique called Fred Heyman's, which was also in Beverly Hills. The original Giorgio boutique eventually shuttered, but not before launching a perfume brand, and that perfume brand gave birth to one of the most notorious fragrances of the 80s, although released in '79 technically, called Giorgio. The men's fragrance, which came out 5 years later in '84, was really just the men's counterpart, them trying to, I guess, jump on the bandwagon a little late. And while I think that is a phenomenal fragrance, it is, like I've said in my patchouli video, more of the Pepsi to Givenchy's Coke, whereas Givenchy Gentleman is a more complex fragrance, and a little bit more confrontational as well, a little more challenging. The Giorgio is sweeter. It's more about vanilla and benzoin than it is about the other materials. And, well, the rest of the story is Giorgio became a fragrance brand only, and eventually Avon bought it. Avon carried it until about '95, and then Elizabeth Arden bought it, and they've had it ever since. And that's really it. There's not much I can say more about Giorgio Beverly Hills. You have the original '80s bottles, which have an amber-colored juice, just like Givenchy. And then when Elizabeth Arden reformulated and re-released it, I think in the late '90s, early 2000s, it was a green juice. And honestly, I think the green color fits that fragrance better than the original color, because it looks like patchouli. You kind of know what you're in for when you see green juice in a bottle. But I mean, smell-wise, they're not too much different. You know, old bottles are great, new bottles are still good. So that's cut and dry. However, that fragrance wouldn't exist if not for Givenchy Gentleman. So even though those two are kind of neck and neck for me, I feel like this is the more important fragrance. Therefore, this fragrance gets a video of its own, whereas the Giorgio does not. It gets a little cliff note within this video, right? That's all I'm giving it. Now, Givenchy Gentleman is important for multiple reasons, but the biggest reason is it took patchouli and put it under the limelight. It made it center stage. patchouli has been in fragrances, including men's fragrances, since like forever, okay? In my video, I mentioned patchouli is like the second most widely used material next to vanilla in all fragrances, period. So, suffice it to say, guys were familiar with the feel of patchouli, whether or not they recognized what was in their perfume as patchouli. Like Prego, the commercials Prego, it's in there, it's in there. So what makes Givenchy Gentleman so important is, number one, it puts the patchouli front and center. It's not a base note hidden underneath a bunch of other notes, even though it is still technically a base note and it is still saddled with other notes. It is dosed in a way that makes it more prominent. You are meant to detect the patchouli and go, ah, patchouli. You are meant to say, this is a patchouli fragrance. That is your big takeaway when you smell Givenchy Gentleman, is that, oh, I'm wearing a patchouli fragrance. Is it still a complex fragrance? Yes, very complex. Lots of materials, lots of notes. It is not a one-trick pony. It is not one of those, and this is a little bit of a diatribe here, but it is not one of those niche patchouli fragrances that basically just take patchouli oil and put it in some alcohol and say, here you go. I'm not going to shout any names out there. I'm not going to diss anybody. But you and I both know there are these $200, $300 bottles of niche and artisanal patchouli fragrances, some of them from some pretty well-known French brands, and you smell it and you're like, oh, okay, head shop oil. You know, just the full Monty head shop oil. Nothing else going on. Maybe a little puff of aldehyde or something, a little bit of citrus, something to base it out a little bit, but that's it. You could just buy that for like 70 bucks, you know, at a gas station. Why are you going to pay some clown $300 just so you can dilute it in alcohol? Do it yourself. Learn how to dilute patchouli oil yourself. Make your own patchouli soliflor. You know, don't get had for a bunch of extra money when you don't need to. Givenchy, on the other hand, they did it right. They said, we're going to make this the star of the show, but we're also going to make the rest of the show, you know, the backing band, worth paying attention to. And so they did. Paul Leger actually made this fragrance, and the funny thing is, he's a fairly unknown perfumer in terms of the greater picture. The only other major fragrance I could find that Paul Leger created was Anaïs Anaïs for Cacharel. He made both the original Anaïs Anaïs, and it was a concentrate version, an eau de toilette concentrate. Today we would call that an eau de parfum, right? But back then it was a concentrate. So those two versions of Anaïs Anaïs, the original and its slightly boosted version, those are the only fragrances aside from Givenchy Gentleman that I could find that Paul Leger was attached to name-wise. Just bizarre, you know. I kind of thought someone like Vincent Marcello was sort of under the radar because he only had maybe like 5 or 6 perfumes that he was attached to, and all of them were in the 70s, by the way. Like he had like a really good run in the 70s, and then poof, disappeared. Where'd he go? I don't know. But this guy, only 3. Really, really odd. Only three fragrances. So you know the usual suspects were not involved with this perfume from the 70s. So you would think someone like Raymond, Chaillan, or whoever, or a Guy Robert, someone like that. But nope, not involved here. Just this random guy named Paul Leger, who, as far as I know, has no relation to the designer Hervé Leger. They're not family. They just share a last name. So yeah, don't go looking for that. Now, Givenchy Gentleman was also a big deal because patchouli, at least very obvious, noticeable patchouli at that time, was kind of associated with, you know, hippies, unwashed people, dirty, smelly, trips on acid, listens to Pink Floyd, whatever, lives in a van down by the river, right? I went over some of that in my patchouli video. I'm not going to retread too much of that here. But that sentiment is not as strong these days as it was back then. But back then, it was fresh in the mind because the 60s wasn't that far in the rearview mirror by 1974, was it? No, it wasn't that far. You still even had hippies listening to Jimi Hendrix in 74. I mean, that music didn't go away overnight. So, and the culture clearly didn't go away overnight either. I mean, the Grateful Dead was touring into the 80s, right, with Jerry Garcia before he passed, unfortunately. But the connotation was there. And at least in the United States, I can't speak for France. I don't think they had a lot of hippies in Europe. I think that was more of a Anglophone sphere of the world kind of a movement. I think that whole Hendrix, Pink Floyd, that was more of an English American sort of thing than it was continental Europe. Not that they didn't like that music there or didn't have blacklight posters in France and Germany. They probably did, I'm sure. You know, they had all the psychedelic stuff everywhere. But I'm saying the focus was definitely in the English-speaking part of the Western world. So France, pretty good. US had to kind of come around to this fragrance. So Gentleman was not an instant success when it first released in the United States. It was a bit of a slow grower, but it's important because that slow warming up to the fragrance ended up not only being in the fragrance's favor, but because then it would obviously, the longer it takes people to warm up to a fragrance, the longer it can stay on the market. I mean, Acqua di Gio, which was released in '96, didn't reach its apex of popularity until a decade later in 2006. That's a good example of that. Givenchy was sort of like the Acqua di Gio of its time. It was a slow burn that eventually people caught on to, you know, just like Bohemian Rhapsody or Nights in White Satin by the Moody Blues. Neither of those songs were instant successes either. It took them a few years before people went, oh, hey, I like this. So by the 80s, though, Gentleman was on fire, and it was so on fire that it was inspiring a lot of copies. Now, most of the copies were honestly probably a bit more inventive and a bit more abstract than Gentleman was, because even though Gentleman is, again, a complex fragrance, it does tend to focus single-mindedly on that patchouli note. But things that would sort of follow in its wake, things like the original Boss, now known as Boss Number 1 by Hugo Boss, another very patchouli prominent fragrance. Things like Ho Hong Club by Balenciaga, which came out in '87. Things like Crizia Moods Uomo, which came out at the tail end of the '80s. Luciano Pavarotti, which that came out in the '90s. That was really late to the game, right? But my point is, all of these patchouli-centric powerhouses that came out throughout the '80s and into the '90s, including Giorgio, let's not leave that one out. These were all a call and response to the popularity of the Givenchy. But it took it that long for people to come around. Like I said, people weren't having it right away. Now that we have the history out of the way, let's talk about the fragrance itself. So here is as close to the original bottle as I dare get, you know, because I'm not made of money. So this is a original wraparound label bottle. It's probably second run though. If you go down the Raiders of the Lost Scent rabbit hole and you start looking up the different labels and the numbers and stuff like that and the printings and everything, this is probably going to be considered the second version and not the first version. And I think that's because the first version was only a splash and the sprays were columns. They were tall cylindrical, gas charged. So if you did want a spray of Gentleman in '74, right, the launch year, you had to get that gas pressurized tall. And those tend to, nowadays, if you find them, they tend to leak. They tend to explode, right? So you end up having to take the juice out of them anyway because it doesn't work anymore. So honestly, if you want this bottle looking like this, but you do want that absolute day one, year one, first issue, you're going to have to settle for a screw-off top and a splash. And just, I mean, I apply all my fragrances in my hand anyway. I don't spray directly on myself, so I don't care. But so this is technically, I guess, second edition because this is the spray bottle that replaced that tall column. Okay, that tall column went away, and this took its place. Now, as far as the juice inside, I've got decants of that original day one, and this smells the same to me. So as far as formula is concerned, This is probably the same stuff or almost the same stuff as version 1. And I've got a little mignon actually of version 1 in my pocket here. So if you want to see what a small miniature version 1 looks like, here it is. This is actually the same box that the big one comes into. If you get, you know, if I were to bring in the box for this, it would look like this, just larger, right? But you know, here's a little mignon, and it's a little tiny itty bitty baby bottle. Look at that. Isn't this so cute? Oh, it's so precious. Little baby bottle of Givenchy Gentleman. So the big takeaway for me is that if you have any bottle that looks like this, or that tall, you know, that tall atomizer, like I said, the gas pressured ones, good luck finding one that works. But if you have the tall bottle or you have this bottle, whether it's a spray or a splash, that is what I call good enough for government work. You don't have to go digging up batch codes and get really nerdy with it. If you want to knock yourself out, I am not going to judge you, but I'm just going to be like, you're giving yourself extra homework. You don't need to. Just make sure that this is what you're getting. Now, if you see a giant version of this, it's probably not real, okay? That's a Fatisse. They didn't have jumbo bottles of Givenchy back then, so the ones they made were fake. Even if they're made out of glass and they look like they're real, they're not, trust me. Now, this version of the fragrance, which in my opinion nudges out the new one. I like the new one. I own the new one. I will show you the new one. The new one looks like this. Here's the new one. So these are both good. You can tell which one I've taken a bigger chunk out of though, right? Which one I've worn more. It's pretty obvious, but I have put a dent in this one too. But the original version of this fragrance is going to be as close to what Paul Lagier wanted as possible, right? I mean, age, degradation, stuff like that is taken into account. But the effective structure of the fragrance, those are my keys jingling, by the way. I got brushed against my keys. So you have effectively a woody sheep base. You have oak moss, you have vetiver, you have benzoin, a little bit of vanilla, not much, okay? But you have a really nice based out sheep or structure underneath. And then of course you've got civet, which in the 70s, musk was popular, right? No, not every musk fragrance used civet. A lot of them used Tonkin or its synthetic version, Tonkatone. They used other formats of musk. They might have used castoreum, whatever. But really, virile animalic musks were coming into popularity. They had kind of gone away for a little while. A lot of animal musks were really big at the turn of the 20th century. Then nitro musks, which were cleaner, replaced them. Into the 50s, we saw the nitro musks kind of pull back, and the animal musks came back into vogue, you know? So there's some things starting in the 60s that played with animal musks, but by the 70s, animal musks were pretty trendy. Whether they were real or synthetic, the animalic notes found in those musk profiles were kind of popular. It wasn't strange, it wasn't weird, it wasn't challenging to the average nose to smell a civet note in a perfume, okay? I mean, that's why Yatagan had castoreum in it and stuff like that, okay? It's just, it wasn't weird back then. To a modern nose, it's going to be very weird, but, you know, you're in luck. If you don't like the civet in this, then you can just buy this version. This version basically pinches almost all the civet out and just puts, I mean, there's a little something in there. Maybe it's civetone or whatever, but, or cinnarome, animalis, whatever. There's a little drop of something in here, but this is far, far and away not animalic at all. At least, you know, I wouldn't consider it animalic to my taste. This one, however, this one's going to bite you. So if you're not into that, you may want to be careful. This one's going to bite you. Also, the rest of this fragrance, the patchouli being a given, is really based around floral notes, jasmine, indoles, and spices. There's tarragon in here. There's cinnamon in here. All right, those give it a sort of meaty, spicy, fleshy vibe alongside the civet. Then you're going to have rose and carnation, and you're also going to have jasmine in here and a little tiny bit of orris, which is unusual for a man's fragrance to contain orris, but again, we're talking the 70s. So the rose, jasmine, carnation trifecta is going to give this fragrance, at least in this original bottle here, give it a slight dandy feel, you know? And I feel like when we move into the 80s, right, and we move into stuff like the Boss and the Crizia and all those other ones that kind of took this on, they up the floral quotient. When you smell Boss, there's more of the rose, there's more of the geranium and the carnation. Same thing when you smell the Crizia, okay, when you smell the Ho Hong Club, those go much heavier on the floral aspect. This one just uses them as background players. This is, above all else, again, a patchouli-centric fragrance. But when it dries down, this is where I will wrap things up. The video is getting a bit long in the tooth for my taste. When you get to the dry down, that is when you get that nice woody aspect of the patchouli. The same woody aspect that perfumers nowadays like to isolate and make like akagalu wood and stuff like that. But this is done the natural way because the whole patchouli is present. But once you get past the florals, the skank, all the citruses in the top, right? You move into the bottom, you get into the woody aspect. And for me, that woody aspect is where the gentleman term really makes sense. The opening is a bit, right? The opening is a bit raw. So the florals, it goes from raw to like this, right? A little sissified. But then what you get into the base, right? So you've already gone through a nest full of cougars and then a gay club. And then once you move into the base, that's when it's like, all right, now I've got my collar, I've got my tie, you know, got my perfectly groomed hair, my square jaw, because that woodiness really asserts the masculine, that heteronormative, stereotypical, you know, I'm Joe from down the street driving my Chrysler to the bank. That whole vibe, okay? That's what you get in the base of this fragrance. And I feel like that's what justifies the gentleman tag. The problem is you have to jump through this wild, you know, gauntlet of things to get there, right? You have to go through the weeds before you reach that gentlemanly phase. The good news is that wild ride lasts for all of about 30, 35 minutes. So if you have patience, if you can hang it out long enough, you get to that woody side, and that's where the dry down for the next 6 to 7 hours or so will live. Of course, if you want the abridged version, you don't want any of that stuff. You don't want the pronounced tarragon and pronounced rose. You don't want the civet to bite you. You can just cut to the chase and wear this. This is almost like a condensed, Reader's Digest condensed book version of this. They definitely pared down the complexity. Again, it's a good fragrance. I've worn it. You know, I'm not wearing it right now though, but I've worn it. But I feel like this one is a little less distinctive. I feel like in their attempt to kind of edit and slightly modernize the fragrance, they, you know, they remove some of its character from it. But this is still a really good fragrance, and for the prices you can find this, hence why you see me with both, right? This is why I have both. For the prices that you can get this for, it's a no-brainer. So do not dismiss this, okay? This could be a good, cheap patchouli fix. I would much rather wear this than those $300 patchoulis I mentioned, those niche ones that just smell like a head shop to me. I would much rather reach for this than any of those, 100%, you know, day in, day out, all day, you know. I mean, I'm going to reach for this one before I reach for this one, but I'm going to reach for this one before any of those others I mentioned, you know. So, all right, guys, that is Givenchy Gentleman. Hope you guys learned something, and this has been the Unlist. See ya.